Matthew Dickerson, small business consultant and presenter of the Tech Talk podcast. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Pav. We haven't talked this year, so it's Happy New Year, I guess. Is it too late in the year to say that?
No, I think we can say that.
Oh, good. Happy New Year, Pav.
Yeah, Happy New Year. I mean, we used to say Happy New Year in June, didn't we? End of June when you were doing the end of financial year stuff for us.
Well, whatever works, I think, is the bottom line.
Indeed. Now, some interesting little devices on your list here. Matthew, I'm particularly interested in the AI. There's a new called robocall weapon, if you like, or a weapon designed to head off the robocalls that we get. Tell us about that.
Well, that's over in America. The FCC has basically made it fraudulent for AI to be used in robocalls. And this is a fantastic move because we get sick enough of some of the robocalls we get now. We've seen those happen in Australia. We get sick enough when people ring and they're real people that ring. But the advantage for AI to be used in that is that they can just be pumped out at a much higher volume, and you can be having a conversation with someone that you have no idea is actually not a person, because AI and the voice that you get from AI now is so realistic. You can be having that conversation, not realise it's not real. So the FCC in America has said that this is fraudulent, and you will be faced with fines. In America, we're talking about fines maybe $23,000 per call, damages of $1,500 per call. So they're making them scary enough numbers that no one's going to want to do it, because, again, I think the FCC has said, coming up towards the American election, this could and probably would have definitely gotten completely out of control. So not a bad move, I think, because, let's face it, robocalls are a bit over them in general, but AI just adds a whole new dimension to that.
I just can't imagine how they're going to police it.
That is the problem, isn't it? It's all well and good to have the rule in place, but then how do you police it? And I suppose the only way they'll police it is by people reporting it. So someone reports a call, but then the real question, Pav, is how do you know that it's AI using that robocall?
Yeah.
Because AI is getting so good. There was a situation recently where a firm in Hong Kong transferred $38.8 million based on a video AI call. The person thought they were having a conversation with their CEO, their chief financial officer. No. They were instructed to transfer the funds in a video call. You're thinking, surely I know my CEO, I know my CFO, I'm talking to them, it's got to be them. But they were deep fakes made from those people and obviously their voices. So they were convinced enough to transfer $38.8 million. So when you can be tricked by that in a video call with people you know, how are you going to pick up that AI is actually on the other end of the line?
Oh, I imagine there's somebody on the back of that transaction that's feeling a bit silly. But, it could happen to the best of us. This brings me up to, because there was laws passed just recently about doxing in Australia, which was quite interesting. But on the back of that, they were talking about how difficult it was to even trace the doxing type information. So I imagine tracing robocalls just as difficult.
Yeah, and so I suppose the thing is they're really worried about the election in America, how much influence all this might have. We've seen some other technology have a fair bit of influence in previous elections. So I suppose the bottom line here is that if a call comes in supporting a certain candidate, then the first thing they will do is go and talk to the team from that candidate just to see exactly what's happening there. Now, of course, if you want to get another candidate in trouble, you might be seen to be supporting that candidate, even though you say, well, I've got no knowledge of that particular process. We didn't do that. So that gets trickier as well then, because you've got to then prove that it was that particular camp, Republicans, Democrats, whatever, that actually was supporting that particular call, and then go and work out whether they've done it using AI. So it does get complicated. I suppose the first step in any of this, and this is the problem with technology, often you get the lawmakers trying to catch up with the technology as the technology is screaming ahead. So the first step is you've got the law. Now, how do you police it? Let's scratch our heads for a while and work out how we might police it, but at least the law's in place first of all. And I suppose it's always the way, isn't it, Pav, that the law is there for honest people. For dishonest people, well, they ignore the law or work out ways to get around it.
Yes, or create alternative facts. Alternative universes, in fact. Okay, look, Google are actually doing a bit in this space as well. They're doing a bit to debunk deep fake stuff as well, aren't they?
Well, they are, and this is a really important one, I think, because we've seen some different situations. I saw Tom Hanks recently, obviously a bit down on his luck. His success in movies over many decades obviously wasn't good enough for him. He was out there advertising dental plans, and I thought, gee, that's an interesting thing for Tom to do. Of course, that was a deep fake. Twiggy Forrest obviously didn't have enough in the bank, so he thought he'd go out and start promoting some cryptocurrencies. Of course, that was a deep fake. And so what Google's doing is they're looking at trying to say, well, let's work out a way that we can actually have some type of labelling, some type of content credential that would show consumers whether or not this was actually an AI-generated deep fake or whether it was actually someone legitimate. And so they're working on that. Now, this is going to be something that's going to have a fair amount of discussion, I suppose, in the industry. Again, it comes down to the honesty of people when they actually post some of that information. Google will be working to see whether or not they can identify it as well, and then it's labelled so that you can actually go and look at that. Now, I don't have a problem with a deep fake if there's an ad there that says buy a new dog biscuit and it's not real people doing it. I suppose I don't really care that much about it. It's an ad, so who cares? It's a bit different if it's someone famous in that ad that isn't really in that ad. So I suppose, yes, you'd want to know that. But just having consumers be aware of it, look at it. And again, when you've got companies like Google, who are obviously fairly large in this process, having some way of labelling their content to say whether or not this is actually a real person or a modified image or AI, in fact, then that gives you some sort of head start on it. Not the end, not the final solution, I suppose, but again, it's a new scary world out there in terms of what is real. You know, some might say whether this is someone real you're talking to right now, Pav. I can say it is, but of course I would say that if I was AI, wasn't I? Wouldn't I?
And now you mention it, actually, Matthew, you do sound a little bit...
a bit tinny this morning.
A bit tinny, yeah. No, it is... I heard a story about people, scammers. They'll ring you up on the phone and they'll sample your voice, and from your voice they can then turn that into a message which they will then raid your contacts and start sending it out to people saying, you know, I'm stuck over the other side of town, can you send me $10, Mum? And it sounds like your voice, so your mum goes, yeah, no worries.
And that's developed. There used to be text messaging. There was a scam that was well known where you'd receive a text from a random number, exactly as you said, hi mum or dad, or they'd obviously address it to just hi mum, or the other one's hi dad. I'm stuck with a friend's phone because my phone's been lost. Can you just send some money to this? And of course, in an emergency situation, your child's in trouble, people aren't going to sit there and go, right, we better go through a series of steps to make sure this is really my child. I'll just send the money to them because they're in trouble. And now that's gone to the next level, because with text messages you can say, well, really it's a different number. Doesn't sound like the way my child would talk in a text message. So that was a pretty basic sort of step. But now, sampling the voice, as you say, it doesn't take much. And one day on our podcast, when we did our 100th episode, I actually obviously had samples of myself and my co-host on my podcast, and I actually did a small sampling. I'm talking about a minute or so on a free website. And then for the first part of that episode, I actually played our voices. And you could tell it wasn't our voices, but if we were Americans, it sounded like us. It was basically our voices with an American twang. and it's interesting because there wasn't much that I used for that sampling, and it was a free website that I used. And I thought, wow, if you had a bit more of someone's voice and you were prepared to pay some money for some of the better sites out there.
A bit more sophisticated.
Gee, I thought you could sit there and pretty easily fool someone. So again, that call comes in, hi mum, it's whoever the name might be, then I'm in trouble. Can you just send some money? I just need $100. Can you just slip that across to me? Even the way they speak would be captured in that AI tool so that it would sound like their type of language, the way they spoke. So it is a scary world out there.
We know Hollywood actors have a lot of trouble reproducing the Australian accent. Maybe that's one of the hurdles that could be faced by the people developing this stuff. That'd be very interesting to hear that, Matthew. So, all right, now we should talk about a little bit on social media as well, because Facebook have been looking at a bit of their 20 years of transformative trends. They're having a bit of a look at what they've been doing in the space, and certainly that's a big company that's come from nothing to be a major presence in everybody's life.
Well, people don't believe me sometimes when I say that it was only the 4th of February 2004 that Facebook first started, because we just feel like Facebook and social media has been part of our lives forever, just about. Same as mobile phones feel like they've been part of our lives. It's hard to remember back to a time before we had mobile phones. But just to give an idea of how quickly Facebook took control, 2004, February it launched. Within a year, it had 1 million users. And I'm not talking about just 1 million registrations, people using it typically on a daily or a weekly basis. So 1 million within a year, that's not bad. If you had a new business you started, you had 1 million clients within a year, that doesn't sound too bad. By 2012, they had 1 billion monthly users.
You're kidding me.
Now, when you consider the influence they have now, if we jump forward to now, 20 years later, because, and again, we've got Meta now, the parent company of Facebook. So when you've got Meta, which owns Instagram, they bought that for $1 billion, and Oculus, $2 billion, and WhatsApp they bought for $19 billion, a major purchase for them there, obviously. When you consider those and Facebook, they've got over 3 billion daily users. And when you start to think about the influence you can have, so if you sit back with Facebook and change the algorithm ever so slightly in terms of what gets presented to people, that can have a major influence on the world. So if you want to push renewables, or you want to say that renewables are bad, if you want to push any in particular product or category, or again, in an election, fairly important, whatever you want to push, you could very easily have an influence on the world. It's probably more powerful than the president of any country, given the influence you could have across the world. So it's pretty scary.
Yeah, it is pretty scary, 3 billion people. But not only that, that you can actually buy this influence.
Well, that's exactly right. And it almost got Donald Trump through the 2020 election. $40 million he spent on Facebook advertising alone. But when you think about the revenue they generate, the fourth quarter of 2023, they generated $14 billion in profit. Now they've had a few
in one quarter.
In one quarter, that's profit. That's not turnover. That's profit. Now, when you consider the fines they've had along the way, they've had a few scandals. The Cambridge Analytica scandal was probably the biggest scandal there.
Yep.
They've had, I think, the record fine was €1.2 billion. Now, for most companies, that'd hurt them a little bit. That'd knock them around a little bit. But for Facebook, when they're generating $14 billion in profit in a quarter, I think they see some of these fines as just the cost of doing business. So I'm not sure it's really having much influence over their behaviour, because they just pay those fines and move on. I think they argue about them a little bit. They've got their team of solicitors that do that. But then they move on because they're just generating so much money from the way they're doing things. So scary influence, scary amounts of money. You really have to sit back and question, are we comfortable with one company having so much influence over the world?
Well, there's also, of course, Elon Musk and X, the artist formerly known as Twitter, but he's facing significant fines in Europe as well. And again, he doesn't seem to be scared off by the sort of numbers they're throwing at him. So is it a deterrent, really? How do you deter these big companies, these big multi-millionaires multi-billionaires, I should say, from profiting from stuff?
And it's a bit like sometimes when you see a sport and you see international sports and someone behaves badly and they get a $1,000 fine, and you think, well, the payment they got for that match alone was significantly more. Do they really change their behaviour because of that? And Elon, I mean, one of the things that I'm not convinced it's the truth, but there's that site on Twitter where there's a young kid who tracks planes of famous people. So he's been getting hassled by Taylor Swift, for example, and he was doing it with Elon Musk's plane. And then supposedly one of the things that influenced Elon to go and buy Twitter was, well, I'll be able to shut down this kid who's tracking my plane. Now, when you get someone who says, I'm going to buy the company because I'm annoyed by this one little user, that's when you seem to have too much influence in the hands of one person. So,
I think I'll be a bit cynical about that story.
I
might have had other motivations.
And I think you're right, but I think the whole thing is that you want to have influence over the world, so you just go and buy a social media company and have that influence. So you start to question then, is that safe in one person? And we've seen Elon Musk's behaviour, as brilliant as he is and as successful as he's been, sometimes his behaviour is a bit erratic, but he can buy that sort of influence across the world. Forget some advertising on a social media site, just buy the social media site.
I mean, it's not so different in a way to the old newspaper magnates. Used to do exactly the same thing.
It's the modern world of the newspaper, isn't it? Because again, there was always that accusation that newspaper owners influenced elections, won elections. You only had to be in the right camp, if you like, with some of those elections, or spend enough money on advertising. So this is the new version of all of that. The big difference, I suppose, that I see there is that a newspaper or a newspaper company might have had a lot of influence in one country. They might have owned mastheads in different cities across a country, but that was usually limited to maybe one or maybe a couple of countries. But now when you see social media, it's pretty much across the world. And of course, in some countries, China, for example, they might limit those particular social media sites. They might have their own versions of those. So you might not be able to get into every country across the world, but gee, you've got a fair bit of influence, haven't you?
Yeah, well, look, and I think the allegation was made this morning or a couple of days ago that Vladimir Putin and the Russians are actually using Elon Musk's Starlink satellite, which he made a lot of noise about, saying that he was going to provide it to the Ukrainians. But I believe the US are actually picking up the bill on that one at the moment. So if they're not grounded ethically, I should say, or open to the fact that anybody can use this stuff and a level playing field, hypothetically, they can be very dangerous.
Yeah, and it's a good example that you talk about there with Starlink, for example. That does provide internet access to a lot of places around the world, and if you decide that you want to shut down an area for whatever reason, you don't like the cut of someone's jib, then again, it's a lot of influence in one particular person. Internet access in the past has typically been country by country, but when you get someone who's got some low Earth orbit satellites up there and they're providing access across a range of areas, then suddenly you have got a huge amount of influence that you can say, well, I'll turn off your internet for a large part of your country. Once you get enough users on, then you can turn off that internet access. So, yeah, again, incredible influence across the planet in just the hands of a few individuals. It's a scary world that we've got out there at the moment.
It is, and even that, I mean, it goes beyond borders too, because if you've got you can always sidestep. If a government comes in and decides they're going to limit your access to certain pages or internet sites, there's ways of getting around that. So even governments have limited control over this stuff. If
crypto really took off in a positive way, then you'd see that the government would be sidestepped in a range of ways. So sidestepped in the economy, sidestepped in access to information. If you wanted to have filters, so that's been a big argument about whether or not governments across the world should be filtering information so that you're not getting child pornography and that type of information coming through. And I don't know too many people that would argue against filtering of child pornography, but once you've got filters in place, then governments can decide what they filter. They can start to decide that they might want to filter out certain news for different types of information that comes through, maybe to make your government look better in your country. So once you've got filtering in place, that's fine. But then again, if you can sidestep that, well, governments start to lose their influence. And I don't know too many governments around the world that like to not be of influence in their country.
But it's not only influence, it's also tax revenue, because if you can sidestep governments with crypto, I mean, basically you're sidestepping the economic system. Governments pay for roads, schools, all those things, which they draw the revenue from tax. If that tax isn't there because people are sidestepping them, it's pretty disastrous, I would have thought, for governments all around the world who are going to lose a lot of revenue from it.
One of the things that people often talk about with crypto is the greatest advantage is the greatest disadvantage. The greatest advantage is it's not controlled by a central government. And of course, the greatest disadvantage is it's not controlled by a central government. And those points that you make there, that you then start to sidestep the whole way that we've created a government. And if you think about government, if the very basic, if you and I were living in a little commune by ourselves, we decide that I'm sick of going down to the well and getting water from the well myself, and you're sick of doing the same, so we combine our resources and get one person to go and do it, and then you keep exploding that bigger and bigger, and essentially governments are sharing all of our information and all of our needs and then providing those needs. So when you take away the finances from a government, it starts to break down that very society that we've created over, well, thousands of years.
And this is happening. I mean, there's a lot of... it's not only just technology that's doing this, it's also the way that the financial institutions and the big accounting companies are sort of putting a lot of money into offshore bank accounts, and a lot of this stuff isn't that traceable. So it's happening on multiple levels, I would have thought, and it's tech certainly not helping it, pushing things along.
Well, you might argue tech is helping it, but whether it's being a good help or not is the argument there.
Okay, well, I'm not sure if that's help or hinder. Hey, we're talking to Matthew Dickerson, small business consultant and presenter of the Tech Talk podcast. While we're in the region there, we should talk about Ukraine, because we've got a story here about Ukraine's effort to ground Russian drones by using a GPS.
Well, I actually remember back to Die Hard 2, back in 1990, that was released. And at the beginning of that, there's the scene where they're working away, the bad guys, I think Colonel Stewart was the bad guy's name, and they've got control of the airport and all the electronics. And then they say, right, we're going to show the power we've got and show what we can do, recalibrate sea level to minus 200 feet. And of course, then planes come in and start crashing, or one plane crashes because it thinks the ground is 200 feet lower. And I thought about that at the time, and I went, that's just silly. You can't go and just recalibrate. The planes have got much greater things that need influence than just recalibration of that. And I thought it was actually all a bit silly and not really a realistic plot. Well, I have to apologise to the script writers. Here we are 34 years later, and it's almost the same what's happening over in the Ukraine. The GPS system relies on, and when I say GPS, I'm really applying that to all of the GPS systems out there. There are ones that are the Russian GLONASS system, and you've got the European system, Galileo's theirs. But basically, they're all relying on satellites sending signals about their position and their time. And then when you're going along the ground with your GPS receiver, it picks up those signals, and you need at least 4 signals to get an accurate picture of where you are, and that then determines where you are. Well, the Ukraine at the moment is doing something quite clever, and they're spoofing those signals. So when the Russians are sending in a drone, or they're sending in some type of device to drop a payload on Ukraine, then they're sending out these spoofed signals to actually put out a signal that says a different location to where it might be. So they're either confusing the drones that are coming in, or they're actually sending them to different places. So they might drop a bomb on an open field rather than dropping it on something that's important. And it's actually easier than you think to spoof those signals. All you've got to do is recreate those same signals that come from a satellite. And because you can do them from the ground, you make the signal stronger. And the funny part about this, or the interesting part, and I'm sure funny is the right word, is that in Russia they're well and truly aware of this, because tourists will tell you when they go and try and find the Kremlin in Russia, their GPS might send them to the airport, for example. Even ships out in the Black Sea, if you look at a GPS receiver on the ship, you might find yourself a couple of kilometres inland, because Russia does exactly the same thing and spoofs signals around important assets in Russia to stop people getting to those assets via GPS on their tourist attraction, or with something that might be coming in remotely.
Very interesting. And how effective is it proving for the Ukrainians? How many drones are they managing to divert away from targets?
Yeah, very effective, to the point where now Russia is actually having to work out other ways rather than just relying on their call it the Global Navigation Satellite Systems, GNSS. Rather than relying on their GNSS, they're having to come up with other ways to send those in. So they have got some other components on the drones that are being sent in that will track their location, but it's just so much easier to keep tracking against satellites in the air to see where you are. So Russia's having to come up with countermeasures now. Again, they're probably familiar with that because they know how to spoof the signals themselves. But the big problem is, if I'm in Ukraine now, just an average citizen, and I want to go and visit my friend Pav on the other side of the city, I put in the details and I found myself nowhere near where I was going, because once you spoof those signals, you can't selectively spoof those signals. They're just going out and throwing people completely off their directions anyway.
I've got a text here from Madge, which I don't quite understand. It says that communication is all undersea cable and special ground-based. Just think MH370. No satellites picked up on anything. Ever wonder why? Great big space delusion. All players must be the same team. That's obviously a bit of a conspiracy theory going on there. I mean, that's not right, though, is it? I mean, all communication's not undersea cables.
No, a lot of communications is undersea cables, but not all communications. Yeah. So you've got some significant cables, and the reason you do that is because of latency. What you want to do is you want to have the signal travel as short a distance from one point to the other. When you've got geostationary satellites, so these are satellites that sit above the same place on Earth, they're sitting about 36,000 kilometres above the Earth. So you actually get a slight lag when you have those communications. And my brother moved to America when I was very young, and I remember having a conversation with him in the early days, and it'd be, "Hi, Phil," and I'd wait, and he hasn't heard me. Then I'd start talking. He'd start talking back over the top of me, and you have this really stilted conversation because of that lag, that latency. The latency is typically only 600 or 700 milliseconds, so less than a second. But having a conversation with that latency makes it very difficult. Most of the communications we've got now, internet, phone calls, etc., between countries is all with large undersea cables, and they're a bit harder to get to in terms of warfare, but at the same time, they're controlled by those countries. But satellites, yes, you've still got communications via satellite, And the Starlink we talked about is low Earth orbit satellites. So rather than being 36,000 kilometres above the Earth, they're a few hundred kilometres, so you take away a lot of that latency.
They're also sending or thinking about proposing to send power through undersea cables. I know they were there was an organisation that were going to try and power up parts of Asia and Singapore through an undersea cable from the Northern Territory.
Yeah, absolutely.
Was it Sun Cable? What was that company called?
Yeah, look, you've got a lot of undersea power cables, probably more around Europe. A lot of power is provided with different parts around Europe. You've got some of those undersea power cables that are hundreds of kilometres long, and so Australia, for example, to provide power to other parts of the world, especially above us, to some of the countries that are above us, that is a realistic option as we go forward. If we can generate enough power in our land to provide power for us in terms of renewable power, then there's no reason we can't start providing power for other parts of the world. One of the things that's interesting is that we learnt a long time ago when we were at school that we transmit a lot of this power that is around our areas, around our neighbourhood, around substations, etc., in AC and alternating current, and we learnt the logical reasons around that, around transformers, easy to transform that power. Most of these undersea power cables are in DC and direct current rather than AC, and you just have less losses when you do it in DC, but of course you've got large transformers to change it from AC to DC, send it under these undersea cables and then transform it back. So it's quite fascinating. It's been quite well done in terms of some of the options we've got around the world. So it's not totally unusual to have power and internet and communications all running undersea. Let's face it, they're pretty big oceans. You've got a bit of room down there to drop these cables down.
The mind boggles though when it's hard enough thinking about getting an extension cord out and plugging it into the lawnmower. Imagine rolling out 100 kilometres of cable on the bottom of the ocean. It must be a big, thick cable. I got here, Mick's put up this information. Sun Cable, formerly known as Powerlink, is an ambitious idea that involves sending solar power via an undersea cable 4,200 kilometres from Darwin to Singapore. That's Mike Cannon-Brooks was involved with that one. It's an ambitious project, right? So it's 4,200 kilometres of extension cord there, Matthew.
Yeah, and that sounds ambitious, but I don't think it'll be that far away in the future. We'll be looking at some of those cables and saying that they're happening. I mean, again, at the moment, we've got ones that are hundreds of kilometres, not thousands of kilometres long, but it's just more cable and a bit more technology involved. And because they run them at such high voltage, you don't get huge losses because you have lower current. When you increase the voltage, you decrease the current to get the same amount of power from A to B. So you don't get losses as large as you think they might be. But again, as you say, they are pretty large cables and they're running in a pretty cold environment in terms of down at the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, I imagine there's a bit of resistance, but as you say, it's not probably like the resistance we get out of the AC there. Look, I've got one of your stories here. We were just talking about insects before. We were talking about bees, but I did mention locusts. I remember as a kid driving through a plague of locusts in the car. Now, is this right? There's a locust here, the story here about locusts helping with bomb detection. Is that right? What's going on there?
Well, locusts actually do have some pretty acute olfactory capabilities. And one of the things that scientists do, I see a lot of now, is they take nature and they say, gee, it seems to be pretty good in nature there. Can we take advantage of that? And so what they're actually doing, it gets pretty complicated. They're injecting locust brains with nanoparticles to enhance their smell identification for certain areas and then using that to detect bombs. So again, you don't need many particles of whatever you're trying to sniff out for some animals, some locusts, to actually be able to pick that sort of smell up. We see dogs used, not by having nanoparticles, but we see dogs used in different ways because they've got such high senses of smell, or locusts are even higher senses of smell. How do you then train them to put their hand up and say, oh, I've detected a bomb over there? There's obviously some processes they go through there to light up to that. But again, take nature and then see what you can do to actually take advantage of that. So scientists, sometimes they get questioned for their ethics for using various animals and various devices. I don't think too many people are worried about the ethics around locusts, though.
No, well, we're going to be eating them soon, aren't we? We keep hearing, so
Yes,
it's
right.
going to be a major part of our diet. But I'm fascinated to know how the locust is going to communicate with the human that there's a bomb there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this is part of the whole process. First of all, working out a way to make it just tune in on one particular smell, and that's where they're using those nanoparticles, and then capturing those signals. Basically, they're capturing it via, get ready for it, by their brain waves that pick up something. So they'll actually have a sensor there on the locust itself, and the neural signals, and you wouldn't think there'd be a lot of those, but the neural signals coming out will actually let you know that something is there, that it's smelt, that's what you're after.
How small must that little sensor be to pick up that stuff?
Well, it's quite
Unbelievable.
incredible. That's one of the things I've seen, Pav, is the reduction, and probably the reduction in batteries is one of the big things. So now we think about our smartphones, that's pretty fascinating what's in there, but then you reduce it down to a smartwatch, just trying to fit a battery and all the technology in a smartwatch. And now you're getting to the stage where you've got smart rings. So they're doing some of the detection that a watch can do, and they keep shrinking down the technology that's involved in some of these. So you are getting technology smaller all the time.
It's amazing, isn't it? When you see the machines that they've created to do the nano, mechanics, I suppose, it's incredible, really.
Yeah,
Anyway.
absolutely.
One that we should mention here that's on your list is an interesting one, and this might be a lot of listeners would probably like the sound of this one. Luminous Literature. So they're designing neck lamps to help us with our book readings.
I thought this was just a nice, simple, practical one to finish off on, Pav. And a lot of the stuff that I talk about is the things that are happening next year, 5 years, 10 years down the track. But sometimes people say, what are some practical ideas for me? And for people that love good old-fashioned books and newspapers, then it can be a little bit hard to actually see some of those, because we find that we're getting a bit older. Well, I certainly know that I do. And reading outside in the sunshine I can do, but when I walk inside I need some glasses on to be able to help me. Having some bright lights is a good idea. So this is just a nice, simple idea. It's a little neck lamp. So rather than have some sort of lamp on your head or a lamp beside your bed maybe, this little neck lamp, again, small batteries inside, but the battery life's pretty impressive of it. 2 LED lights that stick out on either side of your neck, so you can direct them. They're flexible on the end. Direct them to your newspaper, to your book, whatever it might be that you're trying to read. Keep it away from, maybe if you're in bed, from your partner in bed, and let your partner go off to sleep, and just sit there and do it. Now, I must admit, I probably compare them to a set of tracksuit pants at home. You probably don't look that good in them, but they're comfortable. So the neck lamp's a bit the same. It's not the most attractive thing I've ever seen, but for practical purposes, I think it's not a bad one to have around the home. But I don't think I'd go out to a cafe and sit there in the corner and read with it. I might get a few stares.
Yeah, it sounds a bit weird. How far out of the neck does the...
It sits around the neck and probably sits out about 6 or 7 centimetres from your bones on the base of your neck, and it just sits there. And so you can then direct them to something that you're reading directly in front of you. But it does look a bit strange, but I love it. Maybe for a Valentine's Day present for someone, who knows? It might be a good Mother's Day present coming up. But it's just something that's nice and practical, not necessarily visionary or futuristic. But having said that, it's using LED lights, so they're very low on power consumption. And batteries inside there that give you a lot of battery life for something that's actually small enough to sit around the back of your neck. So that's, again, something that wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago.
And, of course, a good Father's Day present as well. And I think that's what you were alleging or alluding to there, Matthew, for any of your kids that might be listening.
That's right.
I think that's what Matthew wants for Father's Day or for Christmas next year.
That's right. I just buy it because I'm a good dad. That'll do, isn't it?
Always great to talk to you. Look, do have a text here from Woz, who wanted to say that if he ever goes to Moscow, that he's going to take a street directory with him. So thank you
Good
for the
idea.
tip. Much appreciated. Hey, great to talk to you, Matthew. Some very interesting stories there. So thanks for joining us this morning and sharing them with us.
Yeah, thanks, Pav. Happy to chat soon.
Good, cheers. That Matthew Dickerson there.